Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its sixth week, the elephant in the room is China. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
Russia seems to be slowly but surely losing this war, but it does have a long-time ally in China. What does China mean to Russia in this conflict?
I think a great deal. I think it was no coincidence, as the Russians like to say, that Mr. Putin made a personal trip to Beijing just before the invasion. He was ostensibly there to attend the Olympics, but he had a private meeting with the Chinese leadership. And we also know that the Chinese launched a major cyber attack on Ukraine, targeting its nuclear and military facilities just on the 22nd, 23rd of February, which was just one day before the 24th when the invasion was launched.
So has China named itself as an ally of Russia, or how is China managing its relationship with Russia?
Well, I think China has been pro-Russian since the beginning of the crisis. Like Russia, it's refused to call it an invasion. It also shares Moscow's view that NATO expansion is the root of the crisis, and it believes that Russia is defending its legitimate interests in Ukraine. So in a sense, at least rhetorically, it's a pro-Russian position. And that, of course, has led to warnings from the American administration, the Biden administration, that China should be very wary of providing more than rhetorical support for Moscow.
So how do you think China will manage this?
I think with considerable difficulty. I think although China, like Russia, has a strategic interest in countering what it sees as American dominance in the world, at the same time, I think the first month or the first 5 weeks of this war have been a sobering experience for the Chinese for several reasons. Firstly, all the accounts from the Chinese media and the Western and Chinese commentators in the West suggest the Chinese have been taken aback by the poor performance of the Russian military. And secondly, I think, and here both Russia and China have both been equally shocked, I think they've been shocked by the fierce resistance of the Ukrainians. But more importantly, I think both Russia and China have been shocked by the coordinated and firm and strong reaction of the West to the Ukrainian invasion. And I think that has made China hesitate to how far it can go in its support for Putin's invasion.
I saw that the Chinese state oil refinery, Sinopec, has paused a project that it had with Russia. Is this a sign of things to come?
Yes, I think there's a tremendous gulf, Bruce, between the rhetorical support and how little China is actually doing economically and militarily to help Russia. And you mentioned Sinopec. There's also signs that Chinese state enterprises are cutting back on their purchase of commodities from Russia, and that's another thing. The rising price of commodities since the Russians have invaded Ukraine has caused problems for the Chinese economy, and so even if Russia gives China a discount on the commodities it sells that will not offset the negative impact on the Chinese economy that's occurring. So there are other signs. There's also been, and although the Americans interestingly warned early on, I think into the second or third day of the invasion, that China was, according to US intelligence reports, and the Americans have been, of course, declassifying their intelligence reports at a tremendous rate of knots in this crisis, they warned that China was poised to give military assistance. But Jake Sullivan, the President Biden's national security advisor, has made it quite clear they found no evidence so far of China's military assistance. And I think China is a careful international actor. It may have weighed up that the fear that it would be hit by sanctions itself, the effects of in secondary sanctions, may make it hesitate to deepen its economic and military cooperation. And the interesting thing is that the defense minister, Shoigu, went on a visit, I think in the last 36 hours or so, to both North Korea and China seeking missiles, because they've depleted their missiles quite significantly in the invasion. All the reports suggest they were turned down in Beijing, although they got the green light from Kim Jong-un. So North Korea is providing some support, but that will not be all that significant in the scheme of things. It seems that the Chinese have made the calculation that not only are they prepared not to incur the economic anger of the West, because they have such a big stake in the world capitalist economy, but secondly, they may feel that the Russian military performance, remember the Russians have lost, according to most recent estimates, 18,000 troops and more than 15% of their armour in a 5-week campaign. And the Chinese may think, well, however much military support they gave the Russians, that it would not compensate for the scale of these losses. And I think in short, there has been a tremendous gap between their pro-Russian rhetoric and what they're actually prepared to do, and that's quite striking.
And you mentioned the economic impact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is having on China. Are there other ways that invasion is interacting with what's going on for China, domestically and internationally?
Well, it is interesting that there was a leading think tank observer in China recently who wrote quite a fascinating memo. The fact that he was allowed to do so was striking, in which he warned the Chinese leadership that, first of all, that Russia was not prevailing in the war against Ukraine, that Ukraine was not an enemy of China, which is true because before the war, China had very good relations, both militarily, economically and diplomatically, with Ukraine, so they have a history of cooperation. But in this memo, this Chinese think tanker, Hu Wei, said that China should really cut loose from what it called this burden called Russia. So this is quite strong language, and it shows you that there's divisions within the Chinese leadership. So to sum up then, Bruce, I think the gap between the rhetoric and the ability to actually deliver economic and military assistance has been due to a combination of things, mainly the fact that the Russians haven't performed as the Chinese expected, and also that the Ukrainians and the West has been their response has been much more rigorous than the Chinese leadership, I think, calculated.
Can I also ask, because China then must be thinking this Russian invasion of Ukraine isn't doing its own set of circumstances any good, because I read that the Chinese property market is forecast to have a 30% default rate this year. That sounds serious for China and for the world.
Yes, it is. And the thing about, in a sense, it's in the Western interest that China stays out of this conflict, because the Chinese economy, unlike the Russian economy, the Chinese economy is massive and has huge links with the rest of the world. And if China was to and China's beginning to show signs of strain flowing from this conflict, that has global ramifications. And there's no doubt about it, the Western world are going to feel, irrespective of the Chinese factor, they are going to be hit by the rising price of commodities, particularly wheat, and also, of course, gas and oil. So independently of China, there is going to be quite some negative impacts flowing from this crisis. But it's in a sense, China must be extremely concerned about what's happening, because in a sense, from the Chinese point of view, it was always nice to have a wedge between the EU and the United States. Well, since Russia has invaded Ukraine, that wedge has disappeared, because the EU and the United States seem to be more united than they've been for years, and NATO seems to be really united. And so, in a sense, from China's point of view, Russia's actions has not actually, it's probably exacerbated the American threat through Chinese eyes rather than it improved it. At the same time, I think China will be very worried if Mr. Putin is militarily defeated in Ukraine. In short, Mr. Putin has presented China with a problem that they probably would rather not have, because it seems either way it's not a good outcome for China.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.